Thank you all for coming out tonight. I think we're at a really important time to have this discussion about a black student revolt then and now. And I gotta admit that I'm distracted because I just came from one of the most intense moments of my life. I just came from the NAACP office where the entire family, extended family assembled of Che Taylor. Che Taylor was, in the words of NAACP President Gerald Hankerson, assassinated by the Seattle Police Department a couple days ago. And after you hear Gerald's description of what happened and watch the video and listen to the audio, I think you too will know that this black man in Seattle was assassinated by the Seattle Police Department. And to be there and to hear the description and to hear the family speak about what was taken from them that they can never recover from was overwhelming. It hurts to even recount it, but we have to keep telling these stories because, as they pointed out, they killed a man. And the media reported, you guys probably saw this in the Seattle Times, the media was clear that they hadn't killed a human being. They had killed what? They'd killed a felon. That was what was reported in the Seattle Times headline, armed felon shot by the police. And then the police sent that story to all the news media, and they just like lapdogs just took it and republished it, right? As if what had happened in the past had anything to do with those 30 seconds when they asked him to put his hands up and he complied. And then they asked him to get down on the ground. But he was only a foot away from the car. So a man who's 6'4" and he's 1 foot away from the car, how does he get down without it appearing like he's moving towards the car? That's what they said, because the car door was open, that he was lunging towards the open door. You need to watch the video and listen to the audio for yourself, and you'll know that there's no way he could have gotten down without being near the open car door. And that's why you ask him to back away from the car if you value his life. But what happened was somebody said there was suspicion, a suspicious car in the neighborhood. Well, why was it suspicious? Because there were black men in a white neighborhood in Seattle. But it wasn't just that the police showed up and gave these orders. They had undercover police there, and then they had tactical teams with assault rifles, and then they had regular squad cars. How do you have all these different teams there for a just reported suspicious car, right? That is a basic question that anybody who valued human life would ask of the police, but we don't have that with the current news media. So they just publish the story as the police report it. And we are incredibly fortunate that we have a family that refuses to let that be the story of their loved one and is fighting back. And they have the support of some very important leaders in the city who've been fighting racism for a long time. And we're just at the very beginning of exposing this assassination of another black person. And as Gerald Hankerson pointed out, they didn't just assassinate him because he was a felon, because they killed Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old who was in a park, who had no record. It doesn't matter, right? His skin marked him as guilty, and that's why they were able to shoot him down. And it's time that we build a movement right here, because as they pointed out at the press conference, Seattle is being used as the model. Right? They're telling us that actually President Obama flew out our chief of police for the State of the Union address. So the Seattle police chief got front row seats at the State of the Union address, and then afterwards Obama praised our police department as the model of reform, right? I can tell you from my own personal experience, having been pepper sprayed in the face on Martin Luther King Day by a crazed police officer, that this is not the model of reform. But it wasn't just that I got sprayed in the face by some lone wolf officer. The main problem is that where's the accountability, right? Because the chief of police directly intervened in my case to say that, to overturn the Office of Professional Accountability's recommendation. So the OPA ruled in my favor that I had been assaulted, right? That the officer had not followed protocol and had violated police procedure in spraying me in the face when I posed no threat. And they recommended the harsh penalty of a 1-day suspension without pay of that officer, right? I mean, it's a joke, because if I had sprayed her, you all wouldn't see me for many years, right? Or even if I had sprayed some other citizen, right? But because she has a badge, then it's a license to assault. And then you can get a 1-day suspension without pay. Okay. It's almost nothing, but at least it was something. At least that was recognition that there had been wrongdoing. But our chief of police intervened to negate that punishment and to say she heard the officer speak, and the officer was very remorseful. And because of that, there shouldn't be a punishment, and there'll be an oral reprimand, which doesn't even stay in the file. So to use this police force as a model for what the rest of the country should have, the model is brutality, and the model is assassination. And that's not good enough for us in Seattle or anyone across the country. And you know, they use the word felon to describe Che Taylor. It's the same way, that's the same playbook they roll out across the country. What'd they say about Mike Brown? They wrote in the New York Times the next day, he was no angel. Right? As if anything he had done before the moment that Darren Wilson shot him down had anything to do with that police assassination. It's despicable. But what's beautiful is that the day that there was no indictment of Officer Darren Wilson, I went and spoke at a rally on my lunch break just a few blocks up from Garfield. And at that rally I said that I thought that young people today were experiencing a new politicization, and that they had a new level of outrage and anger that I had never seen before. As the advisor for the Black Student Union at Garfield, the conversations that I was hearing my students have at their weekly meetings was like nothing I'd ever heard before, and that we were witnessing grave injustices, but at the same time we're witnessing a new uprising of young people who refuse to go on with this country and the way it functions. And then I left the rally to get back to Garfield in time to teach, and I had to pull the car over because 1,000 students came streaming out of the door in protest, walking out of Garfield High School, shutting down the classes and the schools, and doubling the size of the rally. And I knew it was growing and angry, but I didn't fully understand the potential and the radicalization that was going on until until that moment. And they were walking out because of Mike Brown, and they were walking out for justice in Ferguson, but it wasn't just about Mike Brown and Ferguson. You don't have to leave Seattle to feel the sting of racial injustice. You don't have to leave the school. In the Seattle Public Schools, we suspend black students at 4 times the rate of white students for the very same infractions. That's not according to me, that's according to the Department of Education's official study, all right? That's irrefutable. We have a school-to-prison pipeline that extends across this country from classrooms directly to cell blocks that is very noticeable. The machinery of it is very obvious to educators and students. It starts with a state legislature that refuses to follow the law. Who are the lawbreakers in Washington state? They're easy to find. They walk around in suits in the state capitol getting wined and dined by lobbyists, and they've been held in contempt of court by the state Supreme Court. It's not me who's calling these people lawbreakers. It's the state Supreme Court that has ruled that the legislature is breaking the law by refusing to fund education. And yet they walk around free. Well, my students went to the Capitol last Monday to launch the hashtag Arrest the Legislature. So I hope they're not walking around free for long, but these high stakes tests are part of the school to prison pipeline that deny kids graduation based on a test created by a multi-billion-dollar corporation that is designed for failure and designed to show the lack of resources that our schools are getting and then punish the people who are put into that under-resourced institution, right? And then when they don't graduate, we know they're more likely not to get a job, and we know then that they're more likely to end up in this mass incarceration system. And here in Seattle, you don't have to go and protest against injustices in Ferguson when here in Seattle we are building a new $200 million youth jail to lock up the kids that are in my classroom, when we could use that money to hire some counselors at Garfield High School to help kids who are going through hard times. Our counselors have a ratio of 1 counselor to over 400 students. At Garfield, we have 125 homeless students, right? How is that counselor going to help those kids find the services they need, provide the social and emotional well-being for those students when they're faced with those kinds of caseloads? It's impossible, and it's designed to be impossible so that those kids fall through the cracks and get funneled into the prison system. That's why 1,000 students emptied into the street. Yes, it was about Mike Brown, but it was about Seattle. It was about Washington State and our own abuses right here. And this is really sweeping the country. An uprising of students, high school students, college students, all over the country have really erupted. And one of the detonators this fall, following on this great uprising of the movement for Black Lives, this fall there was a detonator at the University of Missouri where there was swastikas drawn around the school, and nothing was done about it, and the students were brushed off and told not to think about it and to just ignore it. And the movement built and grew, and then you remember the football team went on strike, and they weren't ready for that, right? That was some student power that shut down one of the main money makers. Right? They were students, but they were also workers in that they were the main source of revenue for a campus. And that was some serious power that got the president fired. and pushed out and showed the power that students have on their campuses to change the narrative and stand up and fight against racism. And campuses across the country erupted and struggled. There was here at the UW Black Lives Matter rallies and protests. At Western Washington, there was a student that do you remember someone got on social media and threatened to lynch black people? They had to shut the campus down, close classes for the day to figure out where the threat was coming from, right? And so the protests have again erupted around dozens of university campuses across the country with all sorts of demands. But I want to read to you what the media was writing about this uprising that started this fall at college campuses. This one's by a guy, Stephen Moore, who wrote for the Washington Times about this uprising on college campuses. Here's what he said. Remember the campus unrest in the 1960s? Whether you agreed with the students or not, they were protesting about things of great consequence, like civil rights or military draft or the Vietnam War. They had chants like, hell no, we won't go. Those were the good old days. Now we are witnessing whiny college kids marching in the streets, screaming obscenities, or taking over university presidents' offices for what? Feeling slighted? Having their feelings hurt? Talk about rebels without a cause. This lazy, ignorant fool couldn't have been bothered to Google the demands of the students. Because if you go to the website demand.com, how much more obvious can we make it? Look up the website demand.com, and it has literally dozens of university campuses who have all compiled the list of demands for what the students want out of that college in the fight against racism, in the fight for justice. And it's an incredible list of demands. None of them are, we felt slighted, by the way. But I just want to read one list that was on there. The students at UC Berkeley wrote, we demand $20,000 per quarter allocated to the Black Student Union, an organization necessary for black student development. Number 2, we demand that cultural competency training be given to all faculty and staff. Number 3, we demand $30 million endowment to help support black students financially, akin to the initiative that is being implemented elsewhere. Number 4, we demand black scholarships geared towards black students. Number 5, we demand the Pan-African Studies Department projects, programs, and initiatives be fully funded with an additional $1 million. 6, we demand the creation of a master's program in the Pan-African Studies Department, right? Very clear goals, objectives, and people willing to shut down the football team or the campus if they need to achieve an education for all the students on that campus. And to me, it's a great sign that we are returning to a history of black radicalism that has been so defining and so necessary to shaping our country. And I want to talk about that legacy and draw some lessons from some of the great campus struggles against institutional racism and systemic racism throughout history. Because education has always been central to the fight for black human rights in this country. From the days of slavery where it was illegal to learn how to read and write. Literacy was literally a crime, right? It's fascinating to go and say read the laws in South Carolina in the 1850s and before that specifically forbid black people from learning how to read and write. And the punishment was up to death if they caught you reading. And so courageous rebels and revolutionaries organized meetings at night. They called it stealing a meeting. And they would grab people in secret networks and go pass on that knowledge. And then after the Civil War, and probably the greatest general strike in U.S. history of slaves deserting the plantations to help fight in the Union Army that helped win that war. The period of Reconstruction was where public schools come from, right? And it was a black radical tradition that fought for public schools to try to give education to folks where it was illegal before to even be literate. And those public schools, it should be noted, were also of great service to the vast majority of poor white people who didn't have an education either. And were being, it's amazing to see the pictures of those schools in the South in the 1860s because they're integrated. You have white and black kids sitting side by side, all poor and all having been denied an education for a long time. And then you wouldn't see that again, well, even in some places still. You're not going to see white and black kids sitting next to each other. But education again became a massive part of the struggle for black liberation during the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, the Brown versus Board of Education decision was one of the seminal moments that launched the Civil Rights Movement. And we know, that the NAACP was part of litigating that. But what never gets taught in school is that Brown versus Board of Education was not just a legal case. It was started by a student, a young black woman who she left her school and she called the school from a payphone and she said, "I need to talk to the principal." And the principal gets on and she says, "There's students having a fight down in downtown. You got to come quick." Principal leaves the school to go deal with the fight that was made up. And now that the principal's gone, she rushes into the school and calls for an assembly where they talk about how the white school down the way is getting all this funding. Why are they funded and we're not? And she leads a walkout. And it was that walkout that led to the NAACP litigating the case and separate and equal being struck down, right? And we know as well that education was a key part of the Black Power movement, but the Black Power movement often gets described as an urban rebellion in the streets, which it definitely was. But there's an important part of it that was connected to struggles around education and was definitely integrally connected to black campuses and students. You had the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, for instance, SNCC, which was a backbone. They cut their teeth in lunch counter sit-ins and freedom rides and voter registration drives in the South, but then as they developed and increasingly took on the ideology of Black Power, they were key to organizing students in that movement, right? And then I think there's some really important history that we need to take a look at about the development of the Black Power struggle that I recently learned by reading a couple of books that I would highly recommend everybody check out. There's one called Living for the City, Migration, Education, and the Rise of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. And then The Black Revolution on Campus. Highly recommend that folks check these books out. And there's an important thesis in these books about the development of the black struggle that I just want to read a quick excerpt from the book to give you an understanding of the relationship between this new black uprising sweeping the country and campuses and students. So she writes, many college activists of the late 1960s were first exposed to black studies as high school students, especially in large cities like New York, Detroit, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Oakland, where black nationalist ideas were already in wide circulation and where large-scale school boycotts and demonstrations had begun to move beyond the call for integration and now called for community control of schools, black history in the curriculum, and more black teachers. And then she writes, for a variety of reasons, education emerged as the terrain for the national saga of racial transformation. The GI Bill's expansion of higher education, the long-standing emphasis within the black community on higher education, and the Supreme Court victories against professional and primary school segregation reinforced the belief that education was the key to both black progress and the creation of a new nation. At the same time, the combination of Cold War anxieties, a rapidly expanding social science literature on race relations, and the legal liberalism of the 1950s produced a narrative of the underprivileged Negro Americans' gradual and steady assimilation into modern white America. As one student said of the relentless pressure to conform to white cultural norms, quote, we didn't feel we had a choice. The implication was plain that we were being led into the universities on the condition that we became white men with dark skins, right? And so it was that contradiction that education could be the great liberating force. That education could, help people rise up out of the conditions of poverty and discrimination. But then when they get to the campuses, they see that their culture is absent from the curriculum. Right here at the University of Washington, when the Black Student Union was formed in 1968 here by Larry Gossett and then later Black Panther Party founder Aaron Dixon and others, there wasn't a single book used in any class on this campus that was written by a black person, right? And it took the occupation of presidents' offices and mass unrest on this campus to win a Black Studies department and to change that. I just want to read one more quote from this book that I think shows you how the important role that black students played in the development of this black uprising, because again, we think of the Black Power movement in terms of the urban ghetto rebellions that were critical in transforming the narrative in this country and exposing poverty and police brutality. But where did many of the activists who were the leaders of the Panthers or SNCC or any of the other Black Power organizations, where did they get their start? And as Martha Bondi points out in this book, before they founded the Black Panther Party, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton had participated in the Berkeley-based Afro-American Association, a study group promoting black history and black consciousness. As students at Merritt College, a 2-year public college in Oakland, they helped to win the education of a black history course. They helped to win the addition of a black history course in 1965 through 1966. And with little fanfare or media attention, a Black Studies department that was launched in 1968, right? And so it was actually struggles around public education, fighting for Black Studies programs, for desegregation, whether in high school, community college, or 4-year colleges, where many people learned the organizing tools and actually developed their consciousness that they then went to launch into, whether it was the Black Panther Party or other organizations. And so that history, I think, is really critical as we move forward and think about how to confront police terror today and many of the other struggles in education that we confront. There's an important point that emerges when you begin to read the history of how the civil rights movement developed into a struggle for human rights and black power, and how those struggles then helped to launch a fight against the war in Vietnam, and then helped to launch a fight for women's equality, and then helped to launch struggles for all oppressed people in this country and working people fighting back. Seeing that black people could rise up and rebel inspired every section of U.S. society that had been exploited and oppressed. And, you know, before I gave this talk, I called my dad this weekend to talk to him about his experience as a black student at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And his stories are incredible. He thought he would go there and, you know, study and maybe go into law. And what he really studied was the Black Power movement, and he joined the Black Student Union there. And that was 1968. And then King was assassinated in April 4 of 1968, and the urban rebellion swept every single city, had city block after city block in flames, as people said, "You should have dealt with him. You should have listened to Martin Luther King. Because if you don't want what he was asking for nonviolently, then there's this urban rebellion that can be the alternative." But that also erupted on all the campuses. And so they just shut down that campus altogether. The following semester, the entire school was closed. And it's the first place anywhere in the country that they brought in the National Guard to put down a black rebellion on campus. And they were brutal. They had to make an example out of these black students. My dad said he was standing next to a kid on the football team, a young man on the football team, and they actually, my dad is not very big, and they went for the football player because they wanted to make an example, and standing right next to him, they just beat the crap out of him. And that only inspired more people to join. And it wasn't just the black students. The black students were demanding their Black Studies department and fighting back, but all the white students on that campus respected their call to shut the campus down, and that's what actually allowed it to happen, because they stayed away from class, and the entire campus was shut down, and the very next semester they won the first Black Studies department of the University of Wisconsin, and it again showed them their power, which only developed into the mass anti-war movement against the draft, because most of the black students agreed with Muhammad Ali, who was touring the country saying, "I don't have any quarrel with the Viet Cong," right? None of them ever called me the N-word. And you know, as the draft was indiscriminate and taking everybody who was poor, you know, many people of all backgrounds started joining that anti-war movement in a grand rebellion. And I want to talk about, just end on this, about how the movement developed a political consciousness from a fight back, from shutting down a campus or an urban rebellion, burning city blocks, from that, you know, outrage and anger and action, to developing a plan for how we are going to transform our society so we don't have to keep fighting these battles over and over again. And what's remarkable when you study the development of the movement is how similar the conclusions were of so many hundreds of thousands and millions of people who came to the belief through their many struggles that we could not actually achieve black liberation or gay liberation or women's liberation or an end to war and U.S. imperialism. We couldn't end any of those problems with the current economic and political system that we have in this country. We couldn't end any of those problems under capitalism. And, you know, when we go to school, we learn that there were two people that had different ideas about the movement. You had Martin Luther King, you had Malcolm X, and they were the only ones that really did anything. But don't listen to anything Malcolm X said. Just look at Martin Luther King. But don't actually look at anything Martin Luther King said. Just look at him on one day, and then you'll understand the movement. But they're always contrasted, aren't they? Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X. Which side do you stand on? But like much of the movement, those two great leaders actually came to very similar conclusions about what we need to actually solve the problems that we face in this world today. So Malcolm X said, you can't have capitalism without racism, right? That if we want to achieve black liberation, we have to get rid of an economic system and a political system that thrives on racism and needs racism to exist, right? Malcolm went farther. He said it's impossible for a white person to believe in capitalism and not believe in racism. You can't have capitalism without racism. And if you find one and you happen to get that person in a conversation and they have a philosophy that makes you sure they don't have this racism in their outlook, they're usually socialists, or their political philosophy is socialism, right? So Malcolm X went from a black nationalist perspective to developing a revolutionary solidarity. He would say at the Oxford debate, which is something everyone should go YouTube tonight, watch him debate this Oxford professor on extremism. It's one of the most beautiful takedowns you'll ever see. And he ends by saying, I don't care what color you are, as long as you want to change this miserable system, right? The young generation of red, black, brown, yellow, whatever else there is, we're living at a time of revolution. You know, the people in power have misused it, and there's got to be a change. And so you might expect that kind of radicalism from Malcolm, that he ended on saying we have to transform capitalism. But with King, we always get, well, he was a dreamer. But you don't probably understand fully how much of a political vision he had for destroying capitalism and replacing it with socialism. That's where he ended up believing it would take to achieve racial justice, or it would take to actually stop the war in Vietnam and end U.S. imperialism, right? So let me see how many people heard this one in school from Martin Luther King. Quote, capitalism does not permit an even flow of economic resources. With this system, a small privileged few are rich beyond conscious, and almost all others are doomed to be poor at some level. That's the way the system works, and since we know that the system will not change the rules, we are going to have to change the system. You will never see that printed on Martin Luther King Day in the remembrances. He said you can't talk about solving the economic problems of the Negro without talking about billions of dollars. You can't talk about ending the slums without first saying profit must be taken out of the slums. You're really tampering and getting on dangerous ground because you're messing with folk then. You are messing with the captains of industry. Now this means that we are treading in difficult water, because it really means that we're saying something is wrong with capitalism. There must be a better distribution of wealth, and maybe America must move towards democratic socialism, right? Read that out on MLK Day next year, right, at your school, and remind people about the real legacy of radicalism so that millions of college students around the world were saying, if we want to get to the heart of the problem, the root of the problem, we have to address an economic system that is about destroying the lives of all of us. And how do they do that? Racism is one of the key ways that this system is able to create the reality we have today, where you have now, in the newest study, 65 people in the United States who have as much wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion people on the planet. How do 65 people, how do they hoard that much wealth? How do they get away with having that amount of wealth while there's 125 homeless students at Garfield High School? Why don't those 125 students go take that money away from them so that they can live? And the thousands other who don't have health insurance, who don't have a job, who aren't paid a living wage, right? Why don't we all gather together and take that wealth so that everybody can survive? Some of the main reasons, well, one, we see what the police force will do to you, right? But we also know that one of the key reasons is racism, and we've seen it throughout the presidential election. The problem isn't the bankers hoarding the wealth. The problem is the immigrants. So let's build a wall, they tell us, to keep them out. So you should fear, right, immigrants so that you don't look at the fact that we are ripping you all off, right? And the narrative is you should fear the black thug or the black felon. That's who's dangerous in society, to keep attention away from the state legislature that's breaking the law and not funding education, right? And racism has always played that key wedge in dividing people and stopping the solidarity that it would take for us to unite across racial lines, to build the kind of solidarity that would take to be able to defeat the richest people who have ever lived, who are using their resources to make our lives miserable, to degrade us physically as they're doing in Detroit by poisoning our water, or to poison our minds by denying students access to learning about their own culture and history, and the way that they have, don't have ethnic studies and black studies courses in the Seattle public schools, the way they deny access to this campus for students of color. And so these are the struggles that we're trying to build here on campus and in the city. Revive the lessons of when many thousands of students joined together to fight back and helped inspire a generation, and begin where they left off. Instead of us beginning at a moment where we go through all these lessons and then we conclude that we need to change the economic system and the political system, let's start there right now and build a movement fully conscious of the task ahead to eradicate this world of racism and get rid of the political system that thrives on it. So thank you.